الحمد لله نحمده ونستعينه ونستغفره ونعوذ بالله من شرور أنفسنا ومن سيئات أعمالنا من يهده الله فلا مضل له ومن يضلل فلا هادي له وأشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له وأشهد أن محمدا عبده ورسوله صلى الله عليه وعلى آله وأصحابه ومن تبعهم بإحسان إلى يوم الدين. أما بعد. In continuing discussing the book Bulugh Maram from Kitab al-Tahara by Hafiz Ibn Hajar al-Asqalani rahimahullah ta'ala, and we're discussing Bab al-Ghusl wal-Hukum al-Junub, so matters pertaining to the discussion of al-Ghusl and the ahkam that relates to al-Ghusl. So we're still discussing of those matters that author rahimahullah ta'ala mentioned regarding a hadith relating to of mujibat al-Ghusl, so things if done the person is required to perform al-Ghusl. So today inshallah ta'ala in this session we'll be discussing two hadith that relates to of those acts if done then upon the person to perform al-Ghusl and the ahkam that relates to this. So we have the hadith be read and then we'll discuss the hadith accordingly bi'awnillah subhanahu wa ta'ala.
Alhamdulillah wassalatu wassalamu ala rasulillah. Hadith 98, narrated Aisha radiallahu anha. Allah's Messenger sallallahu alayhi wasallam used to take a bath from four things: al-janaba, after sexual intercourse; al-jum'ah, on Fridays; al-hijama, after extracting blood from his body; and ghusl al-mayyit, after washing a dead body, reported by Abu Dawud. Ibn Khuzaima graded it Sahih, authentic. Hadith 99, narrated Abu Huraira radiallahu anhu, regarding the story of Thumama bin Uthal when he embraced Islam. The Prophet ﷺ ordered him to take a bath. Narrated by Abdur-Razzaq, and its basic meaning is in Al-Bukhari and Muslim.
So these are the two hadith that the author rahimahullah ta'ala Ibn Hajar have mentioned in this discussion regarding Bab al-Ghusl wa ahkam al-Junub. So he relates these two hadith. The first hadith, the hadith of Aisha radhiyallahu anha, and the second hadith of Abu Huraira radhiyallahu anhu. So we'll discuss the first hadith and then after we'll discuss the second hadith, as both hadith discuss two different topics. So as for the first hadith, the hadith of Aisha al-Mu'mineen Aisha radhiyallahu anha, that we have mentioned before, she stated in the hadith, قالت كان النبي عليه السلام يغتسل من أربع, that the Messenger of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, or the Prophet of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that he would take ghusl from four matters: min janaba, being the first; yawmul jum'ah; wa min al-hijama; wa min ghusli al-mayt. Rawahu Abu Dawud wa sahahu Ibn Khuzaima. So this is the hadith that was read regarding of those things that are covered regarding ghusl. He discussed four matters. So we'll cover these matters accordingly. Then as for what he mentioned regarding takhrij of the hadith, so the sources that I mentioned this hadith, he mentioned Rawahu Abu Dawud in his Sunan, wasahahu Ibn Khuzaima in his Sahih. So as for what the ulama have mentioned, are those who have explained this book regarding takhrij of this hadith to further, where you find that they have mentioned the source of this hadith. So of those who have mentioned this hadith, they mention Abu Dawud, as mentioned by the author rahimahullah ta'ala; second, Ibn Khuzaima; third, Rawahu Ahmed, also Ahmed rahimahullah ta'ala have mentioned this particular hadith. Also the hadith can be found with Al-Hakim in his book Al-Mustadrak, also Ad-Daraqutni, wal-Bayhaqi, wa Ibn Abi Shayba. So these are of those sources, books of hadith that have mentioned this particular hadith. So again, Abu Dawud, Ibn Khuzaima, Ahmed in his book Al-Musnad, Al-Hakim in his book Al-Mustadrak, Ad-Daraqutni, Bayhaqi, and also Ibn Abi Shayba in his Al-Musannaf. So these are of those who have mentioned this hadith, and of these sources have mentioned the hadith that you have a discussion relating to this particular hadith. So there's a lengthy discussion regarding this particular hadith, where they mentioned that with this particular hadith that have been mentioned, that upon Aisha radhiyallahu anha, that within the isnad of the hadith, where they mentioned the isnad of this hadith, that you have min tariq Musnad ibn Shayba and Talq ibn Habib al-Anazi and Abdullah ibn Zubair and Aisha radhiyallahu anha أنها حدثه أن النبي عليه السلام كان يغتسل من أربع. So that's the hadith, and it mentioned those four reasons why the Prophet ﷺ would perform al-Ghusl, or four matters why you perform al-Ghusl. So they mentioned concerning this particular hadith that one of the narrators we mentioned, min tariq Mus'ab ibn Shayba. So this particular narrator, Mus'ab ibn Shayba, that there's some discussion regarding him. So there's some discussion regarding this particular narrator. So of that discussion that you'll find concerned that Imam Bukhari and many of the ulama, that they have somewhat ta'aqub regarding concerning that they have mentioned regarding, the ulama have mentioned regarding this hadith, where you have a lengthy discussion. So of that discussion, that you find that there's of the ulama who have all take the position that this narrator, Mus'ab ibn Shayba, da'if. So amongst those who have all him to be da'if, Ahmad ibn Hanbal, da'afahu, Abu Zur'a, Daraqutni, Nasa'i, and others. Then even though you find that some who all him to be thiqah, and amongst those they have Yahya ibn Ma'in, Ajli, and also they mentioned that Imam Muslim rahimahullah ta'ala have mentioned this particular narrator in his book, in his Sahih. So a somewhat, Imam Muslim rahimahullah, showing that the person somewhat is thiqah, based upon he mentioned this particular narrator, Mus'ab ibn Shayba, in his Sahih. So based upon this, you have that discussion between the ulama, where they mention regarding concerning that there's some weaknesses in the narrator, but they mentioned that with this particular narrator, that some of the narration is da'if, but you might find that at times of his narration that are considered to be sahih. So they mentioned that others who have authenticated hadith, amongst them Ibn Khuzaima and also Al-Hakim, who also authenticate this hadith. So it mentioned that Hakim rahimahullah ta'ala, he mentioned هذا hadith, in authenticating this hadith, هذا حديث صحيح على شرط شيخين ولم يخرجاه. That Hakim rahimahullah ta'ala has sometimes made this statement that this hadith, it is authentic based upon the condition set by Bukhari and Muslim, but they did not narrate this hadith. So you find that of the ulama, Al-Bukhari rahimahullah, of somewhat and others, who Imam Bukhari that never mentioned this narrator and this hadith. So that mentions an error of in kind of somewhat referencing this hadith back to Bukhari, where Bukhari rahimahullah did not mention this narrator or this particular hadith. That Ibn Abi al-Hadi, one of the ulama of the Hanabila, that he have mentioned هذا شرط Muslim, that hadith as a form of ta'aqub, as a form of critique and correction of Al-Hakim, when Hakim rahimahullah ta'ala, he mentioned hadith is upon the condition of Bukhari and Muslim, when he mentioned ala shart Muslim, as the hadith is not with Bukhari. So more so he mentioned the hadith according to the shart of Imam Muslim, where you find that Mus'ab is one of the narrators mentioned by Imam Muslim rahimahullah ta'ala, where they mentioned that even though this narrator, Mus'ab, is mutakallim fi, that there's a lengthy discussion, or there's some discussion regarding this narrator, as we mentioned, of the ulama who all him to be da'if, Ahmad, Daraqutni, Nasa'i, and others who somewhat have critiqued this particular narrator, Abu Zur'a. So based upon this, they mentioned the hadith that some of his hadith are said to be where Jumhur of the ulama all him to be da'if. Mus'ab ibn Shayba, Jumhur of the ulama of hadith all him to be da'if. That as mentioned by Al-Dhahabi rahimahullah ta'ala, where he mentioned in the book, Man tukullim fihi wa huwa muwaththaq, that of those people that he mentioned, a person that at times that he's spoken about, even though he may be deemed to be thiqah. So you have narrators who may be thiqah in general, but you might find that there's some discussion around them. And this of those narrators. So they mentioned that Ad-Daraqutni rahimahullah ta'ala, laysa biqawi, that this person is not qawi. Even though mentioned Ibn Ma'in and Al-Ijli, of those who all him to be authentic. Abu Dawud as-Sijistani in his book, when he mentioned this hadith, he mentioned Abu Dawud rahimahullah, he mentioned hadith in two places in his book. So when he mentioned this hadith, he state hadithun Mus'ab da'if, that hadith of Mus'ab, this Abu Dawud commenting that the hadith of Mus'ab is da'if. Then he mentioned fihi khisal, that he mentioned certain characteristics or certain features, laysa amal alayh, that actions that there's no people don't act according to it. And we'll discuss that matter inshallah ta'ala, meaning concerning of the thing that he mentioned of these four things. Some of these things there's no per se that the ulama does not accept and act according to it. So I mentioned that of the ulama who have mentioned hadith is da'if, that it's stated by that we mentioned that Imam Bukhari rahimahullah the hadith of Aisha fi hadha bab laysa bidhak, that hadith of Aisha that we just mentioned, laysa, as he mentioned, laysa bidhak, in a sense is not sahih. It is not sahih. That Imam Bukhari rahimahullah, of the ulama of Jarh wa Ta'dil, that used to use very very measured statements when he even criticized hadith and narrator. He used to use very measured words, never used to use overly harsh wordings. That wasn't the way of Imam Bukhari rahimahullah ta'ala, in most part. So he mentioned that Hadith Aisha, mean this Hadith, في هذا باب, regarding what we're discussing, he mentioned ليس بذاك. It is not authentic. It is not authentic. So from this Hadith that is mentioned, that as mentioned by Ahmad bin Hanbal rahimahullah when he's asked by أثرم قال سمعت أبا عبد الله أحمد بن حنبل يقول مصعب ابن شيبة روى أحاديث مناكر مصعب ibn Shayba روى أحاديث manakir. That you have that hadith that are said to be manakir, hadith that are heavily criticized and say things that are manakir, munkar. So he mentioned that with this particular hadith, that they state that even though Imam Muslim rahimahullah, as mentioned by Ibn Qayyim, that this person, this narrator, Mus'ab ibn Shayba, he have mentioned hadith in Sahih Muslim, but Imam Muslim rahimahullah, that he chose from his hadith those that Imam Muslim considered to be authentic. From a hadith that he knew that this person have hadith that are criticized, but he selected those ones that Imam Muslim rahimahullah held to be authentic. So that's of the reason the ulama mentioned Ibn Qayyim or Imam Muslim rahimahullah, even though the person is spoken about and known that he have manakir in some of the narration, but he chose those ones that are said to be authentic, not those ones that are heavily criticized. So from this, we mentioned in the hadith that in summary, that they are mentioned, that as mentioned by even by Sheikh Abdullah Fawzan, he mentioned والحاصل من ذلك, from aqwal of the ulama regarding this particular hadith that he have mentioned. Then even before he mentioned that نقل ibn Abi Hatim and Abi Zurha قوله في هذا hadith, concerned that I've mentioned by Abu Zurha, that as regarding لا يصح هذا, meaning this hadith رواه مصعب ibn Shayba وليس بقوي, ليس بقوي, that is hadith. So he mentioned so from this assurance the ulama have criticized this hadith. So he mentioned that Abdullah ibn Fawzan mentioned الحاصل من ذلك أن الحديث ضعيف, that is hadith, it is ضعيف ضعفه من ذكر. And also they said that no, I've mentioned those who hold the hadith to be ضعيف, which is the majority of the ulama. So amongst them Ahmad bin Hanbal, Ali ibn Madini, as he mentioned, لا يصح في هذا باب شيء. There's nothing authentic on this particular discussion, and we'll discuss it also of those who hold the hadith to be ضعيف. He mentioned Muhammad ibn Yahya al-Dhuhali, Muhammad ibn Yahya al-Dhuhali, one of the shuyukh of Imam Bukhari, but then had a difference between himself and Imam Bukhari, and also others, Ibn Munzir, Ibn Abdul, and others who have all the hadith to be ضعيف. And also of those who all the hadith to be ضعيف from the contemporaries, we have Shaykh Albani, Ali rahmatullah, and also Shuhaib Arnaud in his checking of Sunan Abi Dawud. So Shaykh Albani, all the hadith to be ضعيف, and also of contemporaries, other of the contemporaries, Shaykh Shuhaib Arnaud, all this hadith to be ضعيف. So overall, as we said, the ulama criticize this hadith. Yes, there are those all the hadith to be ضعيف, all the hadith to be sahih, amongst them Ibn Khuzaima, والحاكم, and others, but in general the hadith, it is heavily criticized. And as they mentioned, the summary of the hadith is ضعيف. That Ibn Turkamani, he mentioned, فقد صح عن عائشة رضي عنها إنكار, that Aisha is authentic, and Aisha إنكار غسل من غسل الميت, that Aisha رضي عنها has been authentic, that have been authenticated upon Aisha, that she rejected regarding those who or disapprove and rejected the matter regarding to perform ghusl for those who have washed a deceased. Then also كيف ترويه النبي السلام وتنكره, or she's able to recite to narrate something, then she mentioned that she rejects this. So overall concern that of the matter that's the hadith that have been discussed. As for now, the ahkam that can be taken from the hadith. So the hadith is the hadith of Aisha, that the hadith, as the ulama mentioned, it states that there's 4 things that the Prophet Muhammad that he will perform ghusl after with these acts of those janaba, and so they show the permissibility of performing ghusl in the case of janaba, that we have covered before, Yawmul Jum'ah. Also the second is they show the permissibility of performing ghusl in the person. Ibn Taymiyyah rahimahullah mentioned concerning Yawmul Jum'ah is related to Yawmul Jum'ah regarding the day or attendance of the salat. But this matter to be covered more later, as the author mentioned a hadith related to ghusl Yawmul Jum'ah separately, in a separate discussion. But he mentioned, Ibn Taymiyyah rahimahullah ta'ala, that I mentioned Yawmul Jum'ah is this regarding is ghusl to be carried out for the day of Jum'ah or for attending Salatul Jum'ah. But that will be discussed in the discussion regarding Ahkam Ghusl Yawmul Jum'ah. But it included this as showing the permissibility of this. Then it mentioned, and they mentioned that Jumhur of the ulama regarding Al-Ghusl Yawmul Jum'ah, Jumhur it is mustahab. But of those who mention it is wajib. But we'll have that discussion later on, when it is covered separately. Then the third of those things covered in the hadith, min al-hijama. So hijama, the act of blood cupping. So taking of blood from the body, cupping as we refer to as, that in performing of cupping, then the person should perform al-ghusl according to this hadith. Then I mentioned وَمَنْ غُسْلِ وَمِنْ غُسْلِ الْمَيْتِ, and also after washing the deceased. So these are the four things that I mentioned in this hadith. So as we mentioned, some were mentioned before. As for the hadith that is mentioned here, mainly regarding of the matter relating to hijama, and also we discuss concerning the matter regarding in more detail al-hijama, and also ghusl al-mayt, that also we have covered somewhat before. But as for what is mentioned here, that now the discussion regarding concerning that al-hijama, so the hukum regarding ghusl al-hijama. So as for the matter regarding al-ghusl al-hijama, that's the matter concerned that, as we mentioned, that al-janaba, that is muttafaqun between the ulama, and we have discussed that matter before. The second matter they discussed in that concerning ghusl Yawmul Jum'ah, that will be discussed in a coming hadith. Then as for the third masala regarding ghusl min al-hijama, so performing ghusl after the act of hijama. So after the person perform hijama of cupping, is the person required to perform al-ghusl. On this matter, you find a khilaf between the ulama. That so you find that as for what is mentioned, that it is stated that on this matter, that some narration that goes back to Ali radhiyallahu anhu, that he held it to be mustahab, and it is mustahab in the Shafi'i, and also riwayah and Imam Ahmed. So of those who take the position that performing ghusl after hijama cupping, it is mustahab, and narration upon Ali ibn Abi Talib, and second, a view taken by Imam Shafi, and also third, a riwayah on Imam Ahmed amongst the ulama who take of this view. And Imam Ibn Taymiyyah rahimahullah also have attributed to the Imam Ahmed rahimahullah regarding of one of his views, as one of the views of Imam Ahmed rahimahullah ta'ala, that he only viewed that performing ghusl after hijama, it is mustahab. It is mustahab. And another view that he held, Imam Ahmed, that it is not mustahab. So one view it is mustahab, and another view it is not mustahab. And of those who take this position, that upon Ali ibn Abi Talib anhu, that hadith in the Ibn Abi Shayba in his Musannif, where he mentioned, and Ali anhu قال في رجل يحتجم, regarding a person who perform hijama, أو يحلق عنته, that a person also that have removed the hair from his around his pubic area, أو ينفت عبته, or a person also have removed hair from under his arm. He mentioned قال يغتسل. So Ali, so he mentioned the person was to perform of these acts, that the person was to perform hijama, or the person was to remove the hair, shave the hair from around his pubic area, or third, the person was to remove hair from his armpit. He mentioned that فقال يغتسل, the person perform al-ghusl. That's a narration upon Ali ibn Abi Talib that, and the ulama have somewhat, they have mentioned after this narration that it has been, there's some illah, some criticism of that athar. So on that athar of Ali ibn Abi Talib, that there's some criticism on that particular narration, going back to Ali ibn Abi Talib, where I mentioned that Al-Mujahid, who narrated upon Ali, that he did not meet Ali. So of the narrators, that, and also other late Ibn Abi Sulaim, or Salim, that also he said to be weak, and also that others who did not meet Ali, who narrated upon him. So based upon this, they mentioned the hadith is da'if. Then you have other narration I mentioned, and Abdullah ibn Amr ibn As, and also an Ibn Abbas. But you have some discussion regarding even those narrations, regarding the authenticity. So that's off the view that is taken by some of the ulama on this matter, where majority all concerning that it is something. So that's a view held. Both say that that view by those of those others who hold that it is sahih annahu la yastahab. That the second opinion, that performing ghusl for a person who will perform hijama, it is not something which is mustahab. Even some mention not mashru'. It's not something, an act which is said to be encouraging anyway. So based upon the hadith is da'if regarding this matter, and that's a view taken by jumhur of the ulama. That's a position taken by jumhur of the ulama regarding hijama, that performing of hijama, then it is something which is not something that to be done to perform ghusl after. Where they mention regarding that, that I will mention some who say the sunnah, and they even mentioned here that of those who say it is sunnah, al-ghusl min al-hijama sunnah in the ba'd ulama, وقال به الشيخ Abdur-Razzaq bin Baz. So of those ulama who can add to the list, of those who all that after performing hijama, to perform ghusl is mustahab, is something which is, they mention, some say mustahab, some say sunnah, Sheikh Abdur-Razzaq bin Baz. But we mentioned that the hadith for it is da'if. Jumhur of the ulama say it is not mustahab to be done, as there's no dalil for this. There's no evidence. The hadith that mention it, or those hadith wal athar that mention this, are all criticized. All criticized. So based upon they mention it is something which is, as mentioned by Ahmad rahimahullah, la yaktasil min al-hijama, that called walaysa yuthbit an Narrated Islam, because there's nothing that has been authenticated upon a Prophet Islam regarding this matter. So based upon the discussion that hijama, there's no ghusl to be carried out for this act. So that's concerning that particular masala. So the hadith also, it is mentioned mainly also to discuss this matter, as the others were covered before regarding janaba and yawmul jum'ah will be discussed later in the hadith to come after. So the third matter, which is the matter of ghusl of after hijama. The next matter, that so on the matter of ghusl for hijama, that it is not something which is mustahab. It's not something which is mustahab, as there is no evidence that is authentic giving the permissibility of doing this. The third, the other matter that he mentioned, the hadith, that it states regarding of the hadith at hijama min ghusli al-mayt, regarding concern next matter regarding ghusl, the person performing ghusl after washing the deceased. What's the hukum regarding this? What a hukum for a one who have washed the deceased, male or female, is upon them. Is upon them to perform al-ghusl. So ghusl for the one who have washed the deceased. On this matter, you have aqwal of the ulama. So you have three opinions on this matter. So the first opinion regarding washing, after washing the deceased, is it wajib upon a person who have done so, perform ghusl? Of the ulama mentioned, yajib ghusl min ghusl al-mayt. It is compulsory for one to perform ghusl after washing the deceased. Even though we mentioned a hadith before, that on this matter, so the hadith of the Prophet ﷺ, that we have that mentioned regarding man ghasal al-mayt falyaktasil. But as we mentioned, that particular hadith, it is da'if, marfu'an, and the ulama mentioned it is more so mawkufan asah. So the hadith regarding upon the Prophet ﷺ, that is narrated upon the Prophet ﷺ, man ghasal al-mayt, the one who wash the deceased, falyaktasil, they perform ghusl, wa man hamalahu falyatawadda, and the one who carries the deceased, then they should perform wudu. So said that hadith is da'if. Also, what I mentioned that, the hadith, which is the hadith of Abu Huraira anhu, that is more so mawquf, not marfu, authentic. Then, so the first opinion that yajib, ghusl al-mayt, and they can somewhat use the hadith of Abu Huraira, but said the hadith also it is da'if. And also, they have mentioned, so that's of the evidence of those who have taken this position. They mention Sa'id ibn Musayyib was Zuhri. Of those who take the position, Sa'id ibn Musayyib and also Zuhri who have taken this particular position. And also Ibn Hazm rahimahullah ta'ala. Also Ibn Hazm al-Zahiri, that is the qawl that he hold to this qawl, that is position, that a person who washes the deceased, it is a must upon them to take a ghusl. The second opinion on the matter, they mention that ghusl for the one who have washed the deceased, it is mustahab wa laysa biwajib. It is something which is mustahab and not compulsory. As for that, the call taken by jumhur of the ulama. So jamahir, majority of the ulama, take the position the person who have washed the deceased is not compulsory upon them to perform ghusl, but they see it is permissible and encourage that that it is mustahab to do so, but not wajib. So of those, so you find that A'imma who have taken this position amongst them, A'immat al-Thalatha, they mentioned Ahmed, Shafi wa Malik. So they have the view that it is mustahab, but not wajib to be done. And they can somewhat use the hadith, which you said the hadith, where they mentioned that become mustahab, that they mentioned regarding concern of the statement of Ibn Abbas anhu, قال ليس عليكم في غسل الميت غسلا. Ghuslan, that it is not upon you, is not compulsory upon you to perform ghusl after washing the deceased. إنه مؤمن Muslim, tahir, because the person is a Muslim, a believer, and is tahir. فإنما يكفيكم, indeed it is sufficient, and تغتسل أيديكم, it is enough for you to wash your hands. So from that I mentioned, so the hadith in al-Bayhaqi, one of the ulama, Ibn Hajar and others, all hadith to be Hasan, according to this, to some of the ulama, but overall all that it is not wajib, but mustahab to be done. Then also you find a narration عن ابن عمر رضي الله عنهما أنه قال كنا نغتسل الميت, we used to wash the deceased, فمنا من يغتسل ومنا من لا يغتسل. So we used to wash the deceased from amongst us, some that will take the ghusl and others who didn't. Then they mention يعني الصحابة, and they intend minna, meaning the Sahaba. So it shows that it's something which is mustahab, not something which is wajib. So that's the second opinion on this matter regarding that discussion. The third opinion regarding taking a ghusl after washing the deceased, that I mentioned, لا يستحب الغسل من غسل الميت. It is not considered, they don't see it as encourage or mustahab for a person to do so. It is not something to encourage. And they mentioned there's a call taken by Ibn Abbas, Ibn Umar, and also Aisha, also the view taken by Imam Abu Hanifa rahimahullah ta'ala and others. So of those who all that لا يستحب الغسل من غسل الميت, it is not seen as something which is encouraged for a person to take a ghusl after washing the mate, after washing the deceased. That's the view taken by of the Immat al-Arba, Imam Abu Hanifa rahimahullah ta'ala, and I mentioned Layth ibn Sa'd, and amongst the Sahaba, that's the view that is mentioned on Ibn Abbas, Ibn Umar, and Aisha radhiyallahu anhum ajma'in. That so that's concerned the aqwal of the ulama, and they mentioned that from the hadith, that they mentioned the hadith of Ibn Abbas. So I mentioned the hadith of Ibn Abbas, they mentioned ليس عليكم في الغسل الميتكم غسلا, that is not upon you to wash your deceased, to perform ghusl. That he mentioned إنه مؤمن Muslim tahir, because the person who have the deceased is a believer, a Muslim, and he's pure. Then he mentioned إنما يكفيكم, it is sufficient for you, أن تغتسلوا أيديكم, so it is sufficient for you to wash your hands. So it didn't mean wash your entire body, just wash your hands after washing the deceased. So I said, based upon that athar of Ibn Abbas, that it shows that it is not mustahab to take ghusl after washing the deceased, but wash the hands and the likes. So those are the aqwal of the ulama on this particular matter. ابن المنذر رحمه الله قال اغتسال من غسل الميت لا يجب وليس فيه خبر يثبت. That so he mentioned that there's nothing authentic upon the Prophet ﷺ in taking a ghusl after washing the deceased. There's nothing authentic, so based upon that, it is not yajib, it's not compulsory. But whether it is something which is mustahab or not mustahab, also then that becomes the area of discussion between the ulama. So that's concerning that particular hadith and the ahkam that comes along with it. So that hadith mentioned 4 ahkam, 4 type of ghusl. The first being that of janaba, then of juma. Janaba we have covered before, previously, in other sessions. Second, ghusl yawm al-juma, that to come soon. And the third, min hijama. And the fourth being that of washing the deceased. So that's concerning the hadith of Aisha rata anha, covering those matters. As for the second hadith, so we have now ended with the hadith of Aisha rata anha, and we're going to move to discuss the second hadith that was read, which is the hadith of Abu Huraira anhu, where he mentioned fi qissa. So the hadith of Abu Huraira anhu he mentioned fi qissa Thumama bin Uthal. So this is the story of Thumama ibn Uthal عندما أسلم فأمره نبي عليه السلام أن يغتسل, where when he accepted Islam, the Prophet ﷺ that commanded him to perform ghusl. رواه Abdur-Razzaq يعني في مصنف وأصله متفق عليه. So as for this hadith, I mentioned takhrij of this hadith that Sheikh Abdullah Fawzani mentioned, والحديث in the hadith that they mentioned concerning this particular hadith, that the hadith in the Abdur-Razzaq in the Musannif, also the hadith in the Ibn Khuzaima, Ibn Hibban, Ibn Jarud, Fil Muntaqa, Bayhaqi. So they are the ones who have narrated this particular hadith. So the source of this hadith, it mentioned Abdur-Razzaq, Ibn Khuzaima, Ibn Hibban, Ibn Jarud, Bayhaqi. These are, I've mentioned the hadith, and the hadith it mentioned the hadith of Abu Hurairah regarding the story of Thumama al-Hanafi, regarding how he accepted Islam. So of the ulama, so they mentioned this particular hadith, and also of hadith in the Bukhari, where he mentioned the hadith in the Bukhari and Muslim, where he mentioned regarding the hadith of Bukhari and Muslim upon Abu Hurairah, where they mentioned that Dukra hadith, where he mentioned that the Prophet Islam said, in talaqu Thumama, that you should take Thumama in talaq ila naql qarib min al-masjid faqtasil, where he went to the Prophet Islam told the people, instructed the people to take Thumama to this area close to the masjid where he performed al-ghusl. Then it mentions, so that's concerning the story regarding this particular matter. They mention regarding concerning the story of Thumama. So Thumama, the Sahabi, that his name is Thumama ibn Uthal. So they mentioned, so is Thumama ibn Uthal ibn al-Nu'man al-Hanafi. Thumama ibn Uthal ibn al-Nu'man al-Hanafi. And mentioned that he was from Yamama. He was from the people of Yamama. And the Prophet ﷺ, that he sent like some horsemen to this particular area. They mentioned Qibl al-Najd, to a particular area of Najd. فجاءت برجل من بني حنيفة. So they kind of somewhat, that army, that scouting party that went out, that they captured certain individuals. They found certain people and they brought them back. And I mentioned that amongst them, يقال له, of the people that they found and caught, one they call Thumama ibn Uthal. So he had those who were captured and he was brought back to Medina, to the Prophet ﷺ. They mentioned that he was فربطوه في, they mentioned ربطوه بسارية من سواري المسجد. That they mentioned that, that he was somewhat tied inside the Prophet ﷺ masjid. He was tied inside the masjid to the column of the masjid. So he was tied to the column of the masjid. Then it mentioned that for the Prophet ﷺ came out and asked him every day. Then it mentioned that eventually the Prophet ﷺ asked him, ما عندك يا ثمامة. Regarding concerns, no? Have you now, like, accepted Islam? So Prophet asked, ما عندك ثمامة, indicating that, have you now re-look at what about Islam, review Islam, and wanting to become a Muslim. Then it mentioned that eventually, after this occurred a few days, and it mentioned, regarding concern that the Prophet came one day, فقال ما عندك يا ثمامة, فقال عندي ما قلت لك. Then it mentioned, فدخل فقال انطلقوا. Thumama tell the companions, others, to take Thumama, and we mentioned انطلق إلى نخل قريب من المسجد. So they took him to a place close to the masjid, some trees, date trees close or to the masjid. فاغتسل, then he performed al-ghusl. ثم دخل المسجد, then he came back to the masjid. فقال, then Thumama قال أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وأشهد أن محمدا رسول الله. عليه السلام, يا محمد والله ما كان على الأرض وجه أبغض إلي من وجهك. Then he started to mention, so when he came back to the masjid, then he took his shahada. He uttered the word of the shahada. Then he mentioned that Muhammad. Then he said to the Prophet, yeah, that's not by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. There's Umama given continue by stating that there was no one upon the face of the earth that his face was most disliked to me than yours. فَقَدْ أَصْبَحَ وَجْهَكَ, but now your face أَحَبَّ وُجُوهِ إِلَيَّ, but now your face is the most beautiful face to me today, the most beloved face to me today. Then I mention, وَاللَّهِ مَا كَانَ فِي دِينٍ أَبْغَضْ إِلَيَّ مِنْ دِينِكَ, and there was no religion most that I despise more than your religion. Then he mentioned, وَأَصْبَ دِينَكَ, then he mentioned that, now as for your deen, أَحَبَّ دِينٍ إِلَيَّ, but today your religion is the most beloved to me. Then he mentioned, Wallahi, a third thing he mentioned, Wallahi, ما كان من بلد أبغض إلي من بلدك, and there was no city, no place, no city that was most disliked to me than your city, meaning Medina. فأصبح بلدك أحب بلاد إلي, but today your city is the most beloved city to me. Then it mentioned, so that's under والحديث. Then I mentioned, in خيلك أخذني وأنا أريد العمرة. Then it mentions, no, when I was captured by your scouting party, I was intending to make Umrah. Then I mentioned, فماذا ترى? Then I mentioned, فبشره رسول الله الإسلام وأمره أن يأتمر. Then I mentioned the Prophet Islam that give him glad tidings that he should perform his Umrah. That's concerning, so that's in a nutshell regarding the story of Thumama. So Thumama anhu, that he accepted Islam based upon, as we'll discuss, that he was in the masjid, tied to the masjid for several days. Then eventually he accepted Islam, and clarified before is Islam, what is how he saw Islam before Islam and after Islam, that things change. The most hated person to him was the Prophet ﷺ, his religion and his city. Then after Islam, all this change. So it should concern al-wala wal-bara lil-Islam was-sunnah. Then it mentioned that, Thumama rahimahullah ta'ala, that he died. They mentioned here that he died in an incident that occurred in the Sana Isnata Ashar min al-Hijra. He died in the 12th year of the Hijrah. He died in the 12th year of al-Hijrah. So that's concerning in brief regarding Thumama, regarding his incident, regarding that, why he was placed in the masjid before Islam, and then he took his shahada, and then he was commanded he should perform al-ghusl. So they said the shahid of the hadith is regarding hukum al-ghusl ba'da Islam. So the hadith here is to discuss the mawdu', what's the hukum of performing ghusl after acceptance of Islam. So after acceptance of Islam, is the person required to perform a ghusl or not required to perform a ghusl? So this is the mawdu' of this particular hadith, and they use the case of Thumama ibn Uthal. So based upon this hadith, then a discussion between the ulama, as they mentioned, that of the ulama who take the position that from this hadith of Thumama, that they have come to the conclusion, as mentioned by Abdullah Fawzan, hadithu al-hadithu dalil ala wujub ghusl ala kafir idha aslama. That of the ulama, or from this hadith, it shows, indicates what can be taken from the hadith, that it becomes compulsory upon the one who have accepted Islam, the kafir who have accepted Islam, or murtad who have come back to Islam, that they should perform ghusl. So the one who have accepted Islam, yani kafir asli or kafir murtad, so asli the person who was not upon Islam but then accepted Islam, or the murtad who was a Muslim, left Islam and then coming back to Islam. In that case, based upon this hadith, as they mentioned, the person should take a ghusl, perform a ghusl. I mentioned, فَأَمَرَهُ أَنْ يَغْتَسِلْ فَاغْتَسِلْ. The Prophet Islam, in the narration of Abdur-Razzaq, the Prophet Islam commanded that he should perform a ghusl, and he took the ghusl. I mentioned, وَالْأَمْرِ, as in the ulama of usul, وَالْأَمْرِ, al-amr يَقْتَدِي al-wujub. Instructions, direct instructions, then it indicates that that thing is wajib. It indicates that that act is wajib. And also the narration of Bukhari and Muslim, he can somewhat show the Prophet Islam that he, when he left and performed his ghusl, that it was the Prophet Islam, he approved of this act. The Prophet Islam approved of the act that was done by Thumama. So so from this, I find the ulama that they have a discussion regarding the person who have accepted Islam. What's the hukum? So they have mentioned here that you have thalatha aqwal. The first opinion of the ulama, wujub mutlaqan, that it's compulsory upon a person who have performed, the person who have accepted Islam, in regardless of their condition before, their state of purity or impurity, they have to perform ghusl. So anyone who have accepted Islam, whether the person previously before that they were in a state of impurity or not, they have to perform ghusl. Whether that person also is kafir asli or murtad, that in all cases that ghusl is wajib. Ghusl is wajib. And that's the view taken by Malik, wa Ahmed, Abu Thur, Ibn Mundhir, Khattabi, and others who have taken this particular position. That and also of others who have aligned to that view they mentioned. So they mentioned that so of the ulama who have taken that position, we have mentioned those names, and they mentioned that you have other cases where other companions were also required to perform ghusl after accepting Islam. They mentioned of those the case of the hadith of Qais ibn Asim in the Abu Dawud, when Nasahi annahu aslama, that Qais ibn Asim accepted Islam. They mentioned annahu aslama, he accepted Islam. فأمره النبي عليه السلام أن يغتسل بماء وسدر. The Prophet Islam commanded him to perform ghusl with ma wa sidr. And Sheikh, one of the ulama who authenticated that hadith of them, Sheikh Mu'bil ibn Hadi al-Wadi, rahimahullah ta'ala. And also they mentioned that Sheikh Mu'bil is of the view that is wajib, based upon the hadith, that it is wajib also, that it is compulsory for a person to perform ghusl upon accepting of Islam. And also of those, Ash-Shawkani and also Ibn Taymiyyah. So also of contemporaries who take this view that the one who accepts Islam is compulsory upon them to perform ghusl, Ibn Taymiyyah, and also before Ash-Shawkani al-Yamani. The second opinion, and they use those hadith, the hadith that we have mentioned, and the hadith of Qais ibn Asim. The second opinion on this matter, istihbab al-ghusl, that it is something which is mustahab for a person who accepted Islam for him to perform ghusl, except if the person was in a state of janaba. So I said that the person is mustahab with the exception of the person who accepts Islam but they are already in a state of janaba. Then in that case the person, it becomes yajib, it becomes compulsory upon them to perform al-ghusl because he's in a state of impurity, of janaba. So for that person, he has to, for him to start to pray and the likes, then he has to perform a complete tahara, which is al-ghusl in that case. But if he's not, then he perform ghusl is mustahab, not wajib. And that's the call take, that's the position taken by Imam Shafi, as a riwayah and Ahmed, and a view taken by some of the Hanabila, who have taken that view. Oh, that's concerning of some of the ulama who have taken the position that it is mustahab. It is mustahab for a person who accept Islam that they should perform ghusl after acceptance of Islam, except if they are already, except if they are already in a state of janaba, then in that case they must perform al-ghusl. The third opinion is the opinion that it is yastahab al-ghusl mutlaqa. So regardless of any situation, circumstance, that a person, whether in a state of tahara before or in a state of janaba before, it is mustahab for a person to perform al-ghusl. And that's the view taken by Abu Hanifa rahimahullah ta'ala. So Abu Hanifa rahimahullah ta'ala, regardless the person's state and condition in accepting Islam, is preferred for the person to perform al-ghusl. Preferred for the person to perform al-ghusl. And he mentioned, of those he mentioned different dalil that he mentioned, of those dalil they mentioned, al-Islam yahdim ma qablahu. Islam, it destroy what before, so that anything before that a person is involved in, it doesn't count, and the person is not held against him. Everything for the person start new and fresh. So even that would include concerning that accepting Islam, it is advisable to perform ghusl, but it is not compulsory according to Abu Hanifa alayhi rahmatullahi ta'ala. So they mention now, so you find that of those who have discussed the matter, those who lean towards wajib and those who lean to mustahab. So you have a discussion. So regarding this matter, some of those have explained Bulugh Maram by Ibn Hajar, those who lean to the first opinion and those who lean to istihbab. So you have those opinions that are there. So all of them kind of somewhat, they all agree that it is something which is mustahab and mashru'. Or somewhat in agreement that performing ghusl after acceptance of Islam, it is something which is mashru'. At least to say it is mashru', so it's something should be encouraged. It should be something which is encouraged, as all kind of somewhat see the permissibility of it. So to encourage and to request from the person who have performed ghusl, or to remind the person or tell the person of accept Islam when they return home to perform ghusl, then this is with the three aqwal, it is something which is mashru', but some to the extent where it is wajib, and those it is mustahab. Then a few they mention annahu la yajib, they mention la yajib, that matter. And those who say it is not compulsory, they mention now that there's not many narrations of many companions who accept Islam, that there's no recording or reports of them performing ghusl. So those who say it is not wajib, you have a few cases of them performing ghusl, but many, there's no mention or reports of them performing ghusl after acceptance of Islam. I even mentioned the Prophet when he sent Mu'adh bin Jabal to the people of Yemen, he mentioned أنك تأتي على قوم من أهل الكتاب, that you were going to a people of Ahl Kitab, أول ما تدعوهم إليه شهادة أن لا إله إلا الله. They mentioned there's no mention of ghusl. But the Prophet did not mention al-ghusl to Mu'adh, of those you go into that place of the people of Yemen to call them to Islam of La ilaha illallah, and there's no mention of al-ghusl. So overall, you have those aqwal of the ulama on this matter regarding performing of ghusl for the one who accepts Islam. A matter that is discussed regarding hadith of Thumama, that some of those who have explained Bulugh Maram, they kind of mention this alongside this discussion. They mention a discussion of with Thumama. That's the discussion that is included in the case of Thumama accepting Islam. They mention in this story, they mention that he was placed in a masjid. So they discuss concerning Jawaz Dukhul al-Kafir fil Masjid. So from the hadith of Thumama ibn Uthal, that he was tied inside the masjid for several days until he accepted Islam. So they mention that that discussion now, or this also is a proof, evidence of those who mention, they show the permissibility for a kafir to enter the masjid. So on this discussion that they mentioned, Ibn Rajab rahimahullah ta'ala, we mentioned summary mention, في هذا حديث, يعني hadith of Thumama, دليل على جواز, is an evidence, a proof, على جواز, and the permissibility, إدخال المشرك / كافر في المسجد, or إلى المسجد. That he showed that, he mentioned, في هذا دليل على جواز إدخال المشرك إلى المسجد. That he showed the permissibility of a mushrik, kafir, non-Muslim, entering the masjid. That I mentioned, لكن بإذن مسلمين, but with the permissibility, but with the permission of the Muslim. So the person within the Muslim can enter the masjid, but with the permission of the Muslims. Then I mentioned that فأنزل النبي عليه السلام وقف ثقيف في المسجد. The Prophet are allowed different like delegation of the kuffar to enter the masjid. So that's going to somewhat to soften their art and to bring them to and to explain to them Islam. So overall I mentioned to know that this was been done by the Prophet ﷺ. We have allowed al-kuffar, non-Muslim, to enter the masjid. Then I mentioned that وقد اختلف أهل العلم. So they mentioned that قد اختلف أهل العلم في ذلك. We find out now a khilaf between the ulama on this matter. Is it allowed? Is it allowed for a non-Muslim to enter the masjid? So we find out a khilaf between the ulama. They mentioned رخص طائفة منهم في دخول الكافر المسجد. So of the ulama who give a permissibility of giving an allowance, a concession for the non-Muslim to enter a masjid. وهو قول of those who give that concession هو قول أبو حنيفة, شافعي, وحكي رواية and Ahmed. So of those who say it is allowed, Abu Hanifa, Shafi, حكي is narrated upon Ahmed of one of his narration, قال أصحاب الشافعي. So that's concerning of those. Then I mentioned that another view, قال أصحاب الشافعي وليس له أن يدخل المسجد إلا بإذن المسلم, that the non-Muslim should not enter the masjid except with the permission of a Muslim. وقال بعضهم, of also those who have said, لا يجوز للمسلم أن يهذن فيه إلا بمصلحة من سماع القرآن أو رجاء إسلام أو إصلاح شيء ونحو ذلك. So the second view of the ulama that it is not allowed for the kafir, the Muslims, to allow the kafir to enter the masjid. It is not allowed except there's some either benefit of the person Sama al-Quran for da'wah purpose, or for the person, maybe the person want to accept Islam, or to rectify something in the masjid, so to do some work possibly in the masjid. So I said no, those are the reason behind allowing a non-Muslim to enter the masjid, that there should be a reason. They mentioned أما للمجرد أكل ولبث واستراحة فلا. As for a non-Muslim enter the masjid just to relax, or to enter the masjid just to come in and to eat, and sometimes sit and wait for someone, they say no. It has to be for the person entering because for dawah reason, or they're supposed to be doing a task in the masjid. They're doing some work in the masjid. Then I mentioned وهذا كله في المساجد الحل, and this discussion regarding all those masajid said the Masjid al-Hill, the local masajid. أما مسجد الحرام, so that's concerned. So as for Masjid al-Haram, concern Masjid al-Haram, فلا يجوز للمسلمين الإذن في دخول للكافر. As for Masjid al-Haram, they mean concern this masjid, that Masjid al-Haram, Masjid al-Mecca, that not allowed for them to enter, and بل لا يمكن الكافر من دخول الحرم بكلية عند الشافعي وأحمد. So the ulama who all are concerned to know that the kafir should not enter the haram at all, should not enter. They mention, and the evidence for the mention last part that I mentioned my sentence, إنما المشركون نجس فلا يقربوا مسجد الحرام بعد عامهم هذا. So based upon that, they mentioned in Surah Al-Tawbah that إنما المشركون نجس, that the mushrikeen, that they are said to be impure, and I mentioned that لا يقربوا, they are not to come close to Masjid al-Haram, which is Mecca. After this year, meaning concerned during the time of the Prophet ﷺ, so they mentioned from this that they are not to come or enter the Prophet ﷺ, enter the Masjid in al-Haram, according to that view. So they mentioned that أجازه, that view that they are not allowed, أجازه أبو حنيفة وأصحابه. وأما مسجد المدينة, but regarding Masjid al-Haram, Abu Hanifa rahimahullah, all that is permissible for them to enter Masjid al-Haram in Mecca. So Masjid al-Haram al-Mekki, that Imam Ahmed wa Shafi said they are not allowed at all. Imam Abu Hanifa gives some permissibility for them to enter Masjid al-Haram. And I mentioned أما المسجد المدنية المسجد المدينة, as for Masjid al-Medina, فقال والمشهور عندنا يعني حنابلة يعني أنابلة وعند الشافعية أن حكمه حكم مسجد الحل. That as for the Masjid al-Nabawi, that it takes the ruling of Masjid al-Hill concerning other local masajid. So you have Masjid al-Haram, al-Mekki, they're not allowed with the Hanabila and the Shafi'iyah. As for Masjid al-Nabawi and all other masjid, then they mention it, that as we have discussed, that that they give a permissibility. They give a permissibility for them to enter Masjid al-Madinah, as in this case of Thumama, for the purpose of dawah, and also other masajid for the purpose of dawah and the likes. But not just to come and just to sit for no purpose and chill out. It should be for a purpose, or they are allowed to come in to do some work. So, and also regarding, so that's concerning the aqwal of the ulama regarding al-kafir, dukhul al-kafir al-masajid, the permissibility of the Muslim, of the kafir entering the masajid. So that's concerning those discussion regarding that particular matter. The hadith of Thumama, is it for, mentioned that he went and performed ghusl, then came back and took his shahada. So is it, so I mentioned, the ulama mentioned, that is ideal for a person to do so after taking the shahada. That the ghusl to be performed after taking the shahada. So after the person ordered the shahada, then they all go and perform ghusl as soon as that they're able. So that's the hadith that that's concerned, the Prophet Islam concerned about giving present regarding a dawah, that even allowing a kafir to be to remain in the masjid, so you can see how the Muslim function and see what is Islam, of the experience of Islam, then that may open a person's heart. And with Thumama, it did eventually, after a few, they opened his heart and he took the shahada. So it shows regarding that, and show the Muslim having rifq and putting also effort in giving the shahada, in taking Islam to others and inviting others to Islam. But with rifq, as in this case, the Prophet Islam used rifq, ask him, so being that consistent also with Thumama, day to day ask him about what's going on until eventually he took a shahada. So that inshallah ta'ala are of those ahkam that relates to this particular hadith, or these two hadith that I mentioned. So the one that we went into detail more so regarding taking ghusl in the state of hijama, what's the ruling on that? Also the case of washing of the deceased. And third, in the case of a person who have accepted Islam. And also the fourth matter that we discussed with some more detail, the person who is a non-Muslim entering a masjid. Is it allowed or not? We mentioned this a difference between al-Haram al-Mekki, according to what I mentioned by the ulama, and also other masajid other than Haram al-Mekki, including al-Medina, Masjid al-Medina, about a kafir entering, and we have outlined the aqwal on this matter. So especially in the West, there are times a lot of Muslims come to the masajid to know about Islam and take the shahada. So for the masajid to be more mindful of this and more accommodative of people who want to take the shahada and wants to come to the masjid and to understand about Islam, to be more, to tell us to be more mindful and of this matter, and not to be of those who somewhat do not see the masjid only for Muslim and do not accept no one but Muslim. So we can somebody be more considerate on that matter regarding giving a dawah to the community in the West and the Muslim countries. So that inshallah will end this discussion. وبالله تعالى توفيق وهذه السبيل والآخر دعوانا الحمد لله. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته.